Welcome back to another episode of Church is Stupid.
Comma butt.
I'm Ruth.
Hi, everybody. I'm Andy. And you may notice that this episode's going to be a little bit different than usual because we have two guests joining us that are not actually sitting here at the table with us. So microphones are a little bit different. Our first guest, which, you know, everybody knows here, Elijah.
Hello. I am a guest today and not a normal part of the podcast.
Thank you, Robot Elijah, for that introduction.
He actually is just a bunch of recordings that we have just sitting there on a soundboard.
I never even got married. That's the craziest part.
It's really great to be here.
More importantly, joining us today, we have a longtime friend of myself. We have come up in ministry together. We started the whole process in the United Methodist Church together, and Andy had to listen to a lot of our story before this started. Very patiently, I might add. Elizabeth Hurd.
Hey,
Welcome.
hi. Yay. So glad that we could actually make this work.
Yes, I'm glad that it did work out after my many failed attempts at trying to get you on here. So do you want to share a little bit about yourself and why you're here?
Yeah, well, my name is Elizabeth Hurd. I'm currently pastoring in Caledonia, Michigan at the Caledonia United Methodist Church. And I guess the reason I'm here is, like Ruth said, we've come up through this entire process together. I think we actually declared candidacy at the same time.
We did.
I think. Yeah. And so I've heard all about the podcast and about the work that y'all are doing and loved the idea and said, anytime you need a guest, just let me know.
And little did she know that we would. We would let her know. And here you are now.
So
Yay.
I'm very curious. What was your reaction when you first heard about the podcast? Or I'm also going to ask this question. Did you hear about the name of the podcast first, or did you hear about the idea behind the podcast first?
I think it was a both and, actually. I think Ruth and I were talking a little bit about the idea behind the podcast. And then she told me the name, and I was like, yes, that sounds fantastic. So I think it kind of happened around both happened around the same time. And I was just like, yeah, this sounds great.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny because I actually couldn't remember the answer to that question. So I was like, oh, what did I say? But you probably got the original name, right? You just The Church is Stupid, no comma but.
Yes, I think you were like, I just want to call it Church is Stupid. And I said, sounds perfect. Go for it.
Most of us pastors are just like, yeah, we feel
agreed.
that. And so today is also a special episode for another reason, and that's because it is our 50th episode today. And now is when I wish I had that soundboard to make silly noises that you always talk about that we never have.
That I always talk about. I could probably set up. It's not a time.
not a time. But
We would
yes,
have managed to ruin the podcast with that, I think, if we got
we
it.
would have.
Oh, yeah, for
full
sure.
episode of just us playing with it.
It would be terrible.
There's a conversation had in kazoo noises.
Oh my gosh, no.
This is why we can't have nice things. But anyhow, yeah, we can't. I honestly, when we started this podcast back in, gosh, it's only really been, 7-8 months now?
Uh-huh.
I don't think I would have imagined us getting to 50 episodes.
Well, it's a little easier when you got, 2 a week, but...
It's true. But admittedly, I don't even think I'd listened to a podcast before we started doing one.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't really know what I was getting myself into, but I think it's been a lot of fun, at least for us. I hope it's been fun for all of you guys who've been listening and joining along. We have a small but loyal following.
That's good. Well, Ruth, that really sounds like a hard conversation that you're having with yourself.
Oh, wow. Good segue, Andy.
Thanks.
This was totally inconspicuous. As you may have guessed now, our topic for today is hard conversations. Figure what a better 50th episode than to talk about the stuff we don't want to talk about.
Oh, yeah, that sounds...
Yeah.
Thanks, Elijah, for the half-hearted response.
Let's push ourselves out of our comfort zones.
Yeah, and this is one thing which Elizabeth had brought to me back, gosh, I think when we first started talking about doing this podcast, she was like, if you ever have one on hard conversations, I want to be a part of it. And so I've intentionally pushed this off until I could get you on this podcast, Elizabeth.
I feel honored.
So
Wow.
we specifically named it The Church and Hard Conversations. No specific topic in mind, just actual the concept of hard conversations as a whole. Just for you.
Thank you.
But it's only going to be you talking for the full hour. We're just going to be silent.
Yeah,
So,
so
all right,
this
have
is,
fun.
this is
I'm gonna-
actually
I'm
where
gonna
we're
mute
cutting
myself.
out. So
Yeah.
Yeah, good luck.
I did arrange an entire monologue, so.
Well, that worked out
Oh,
perfect.
yeah.
Anyhow, yeah, I loved the topic when you brought it up, Elizabeth, because it's been my experience in the church that when it comes to the things that make people uncomfortable, rather than face them head on, there's this desire to kind of code it in like a one verse answer and then run away. Like I think about oh gosh, this is really cheesy because I love Christmas music, so don't shame me. But the Grinch song, where he's like, I wouldn't touch it with a 9.5-foot pole. That's the church with like anything that's tougher than an answer that's just Jesus or God or the Bible. They're like, I'm good. Is that fair?
yeah, Ruth, you're kind of a mean one.
Thanks, Mr. Grinch.
Hey,
I was trying so hard to come up with some kind of joke.
I think
No,
it failed
that's
pretty
like
good.
a
yeah,
fair
fully.
assessment, though, Ruth.
Yeah.
Like I think you're right. We'd much rather not face the hard conversations because we know they're going to be divisive than have them faithfully within the church spaces.
When I think there's also this fear, at least for people like myself, I don't want to say the wrong thing or have the wrong conversation. So like if I'm going to talk about something that's like a more difficult topic, I want to make sure that I know what I believe about it first before I can go into that conversation. So that way I'm not accidentally leading people astray, right? So part of my story was that I avoided going into ministry for what I call a long time, what pastors who started when they were in like their 40s or 50s consider a long time. They kind of laugh at me when I say it, but I avoided it because I take the role of leaders in the church very, very seriously. And it terrifies me that I would teach some theology or doctrine that I would teach would be absolutely incorrect. And I would just lead a whole bunch of people astray, or that I would hurt people and do harm when I was trying to do good. So kind of that weight. Would you say, Elizabeth, that you felt that weight as well going into ministry?
I think so, because I think part of it is like you always want to do right by your people and you want to lead them to a more loving place. And I think some of these hard conversations that we want to have, or these theological things we want to talk about, like you have to be really grounded in what you believe and stuff like that. So that way you're trying to show them you're coming from a loving place and not, I don't know. I think my bigger fear was that like I would have my beliefs so firmly rooted that people would think I wouldn't be able to have a conversation in good faith with them. I think that was my bigger fear. Not so much that I would lead them astray or say the wrong thing, but that they wouldn't listen to me if they disagreed with me, or they would just assume I was trying to change their minds by using my power. Yeah.
Right, and I think we have to weigh very seriously the things that we take a hard stance on. Right, the things that and we talked about this a little bit last week on our episode about the dogma versus doctrine versus opinion. Like, what are you going to take a really hard stand on? And to me, that usually falls into the dogma category. Like, I will defend dogma until I'm blue in the face. But when it comes to theology, I'm much more open to having conversation, because I think there's conversation that needs to be had, particularly about a lot of the theologies we follow and whether or not those are doing harm or whether or not they're promoting the gospel, essentially. But when it comes to, having these hard conversations, I think the last year has kind of really shown that there are two kinds of churches, right? There's the kinds of churches that are going to just stay in staunchly in this particular, I believe this, therefore everyone else must kowtow to me. Or the churches that are super wishy-washy and don't want to make any decisions because any decision will offend somebody. And it's been interesting, really, watching over the past year and a half the ways that the church, or different churches, have responded to things like this pandemic, to the Black Lives Matter movement, to all of that stuff, because in a lot of ways, I think that it was a missed opportunity for a lot of churches.
I think this year has definitely been a year of the hard conversations. But I also think, I think, yes, it's a missed opportunity, but I also think that, like, in particular, knowing the United Methodist Church, like, a little bit, and, like, knowing our legislative process and knowing all of that kind of a thing, like, there are more steps than just a church being, like, you know, accepting of new ideas and all this kind of a thing. Like, there's so many, like, hoops that you have to jump through in order to, like, acknowledge an idea or that kind of a thing, or at least, you know, from what I see. And so there is this, it is a lost opportunity, period. But, like, eventually we'll get to the point where we acknowledge these new ideas, but it'll be like 20 years too late, kind of a thing. And I think that's very detrimental to us, that, like, we really can't have these hard conversations when it's time to have the hard conversations.
You know, fun fact about the United Methodist Church as a denomination and as an institution having the hard conversations is that it was, gosh, I don't know. I have a friend who talked about the civil rights movement in the United Methodist Church a lot at seminary, and it was something like a couple of years, like 3 to 5 years after Brown versus the Board of Education, the United Methodist Church made a stance on it. Don't quote me on that. I'm going to look that up right now. But
I mean, that sounds like, I mean, you know, the United Methodist Church.
There was something about, like, there was a difference between when a good amount of time between when the Supreme Court made their ruling and when the UMC said something official on it, or the Methodist Church, I guess, because maybe we were new at that. We weren't quite the UMC at that point. But yeah, just denominationally, I do think we have to jump through a lot of hoops in order to just talk about some of these hard things. But as a local church, I think it's a little easier to dig down into the conversations, or at least initiate them, as opposed to having to jump through all the hoops of, like, is this legislation going to be passed at conference? Are we going to make an official stance on this? Is this going to come out 4 years too late? That sort of thing.
Well, it's actually really funny because I think, especially in the United Methodist Church, John Wesley was like, he did not wait for anything. There were times where he probably responded way faster than he needed to. I can remember reading one of his responses to some theology or another that he offered, and it was like 3 days after it had been issued, right? He writes this response, and it was terrible. I was like, John Wesley, you should have just sat down for like 5 seconds and thought about what you were saying, because it was not great. But he was very much so like, no, I feel like in a lot of ways he wanted to attack those hard conversations, that he wanted to face them head on, and saw an Anglican church that wasn't doing it at the time. And so that's why people got really mad at him, because he was like, no, we have to have these kinds of conversations and start actually doing things, right? It's not just about having the conversation, but it's then living it out as well.
Do you have any specific examples of that, of Wesley doing that in history that you could pull from? Because I don't really know a lot about the history of Wesley that much at all.
I mean, if you asked 4 years ago, Ruth, I could probably pull lots out. But today I would say one of the best examples, I think, of stances that he took was particularly at the time in England, things where there was a really big drinking problem in England back then, which had to do a lot with overpopulation and things like that. And there wasn't a lot of there's a lot of non-jobs and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
Elizabeth, is that a fair assessment of what was happening in England at John Wesley's day?
I'd say so, yeah.
And so he took he took a lot of stances against, like, about how to bring families back together, how to money manage, how to really take care of yourself so you can take care of others.
Okay.
And would take stances on those issues because that's what they were dealing with at the time, right?
Okay.
And in particular, that's one of the reasons why the United Methodist Church and Methodist churches are so involved in social justice, because Wesley had, his saying was, you can't feed someone spiritually if they're hungry. Like,
yeah.
how can they hear if they're starving? You have to take care of those things before you can feed spiritually. Right.
A lot of Wesley's theology translates into something that's really practical for tackling on like the conditions of the world and all that kind of stuff. And so where we're not quite as we're not quite as doctrinal or dogmatic as other churches are. We don't have like the specific all of the universal prayers we have, but we don't have like these really specific, like, this is what you must believe, this is the theology you must believe. It's just more like, hey, this is what grace is, and like, here's how you live it out. And like the entire idea of sanctifying grace is all about, you love God more, you love your neighbor more, and here's all of the ways that you do that really, really practically.
Okay. Yeah.
It was always a very, very practical faith, hence the name Methodist, because it was very methodical. Which I think in some ways has hindered, in some ways has helped, much like many things. But the premise essentially that our whole denomination was really founded on this idea of hard conversations. And even further, if we take it back to, we look at the way Jesus dealt with problems, the way the prophets dealt with problems back in the day, the way that Paul dealt with problems, they were very
direct.
They were very direct. They dealt with issues immediately. Like, one of my favorites from, I believe it was, who was the prophet who went to David? Was it Samuel or Nathan? Nathan.
Yeah.
It's, my two brothers are Sam and Nate, so I get them confused for that simple reason. But Nathan goes to David, and he's like, this was after everything that happened with Bathsheba. And he's like, so, let me tell you a story about a dude who steals sheeps from other people, even though he has a ton himself. And then David's like, oh, wow, that guy seems pretty crappy. And Nathan's like, yeah, that's you. You kind of suck.
I remember that episode of VeggieTales, honestly.
Yeah, that's the only reason I know it.
The rubber ducky.
Yeah, it was the rubber. That was one of the
King
best
George and the rubber
the
ducky.
P comes after the rubber ducky incident, and he tells the entire story on like a felt board. He like pulls it out, and he has all the like little felt.
And it's Junior who's the saddest. He's the saddest. Is he asparagus or broccoli?
He's asparagus.
Junior's asparagus. But
okay.
Yeah.
These are the hard conversations we have to talk about, by the way.
VeggieTales.
Well, VeggieTales does a wonderful job talking about these hard conversations.
It really does. Well,
in some ways, it actually kind of does. I think. Maybe for kids, but still. Like...
Yeah, there's Nathan and the prophets, which, I mean, that was probably one of the nicest ways a prophet told a king they sucked.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even getting out of the prophets, like, isn't all of Paul's letters, aren't they just Paul having the hard conversations with churches?
Oh, 100%. And if you look at Jesus's teachings, same thing. Yeah. I think we water down a lot of Jesus's messages now because we don't understand context and we don't understand what was really happening at that time to understand how harsh he kind of was sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, or like how he followed John the Baptist, who literally called people like a brood of vipers. Like, talk about being offensive. Like,
well,
it's so hard because you're just like, you want to be able to address these, like, the big topics that we should be able to address in faithful context, and we have precedent to do that, and shying away from it, or feeling like we're not in the right position to do it can hinder us a lot.
So I'm going to ask this question to you, Elizabeth, and to Ruth. Like, being in the positions that you guys are, what stops you, like, just specifically you, what would stop you from having a hard conversation with somebody? Like, a Pharisee comes up to you and says, this person did X, they need to be stoned to death. Like, what could stop you from either like, you know, telling this man off like, hey, we need to love that man, or like all this kind of stuff? Because I think that is a difference that we see. And I'm not saying like all teachers need to be Jesus. Like, yes, it's what we strive for, but like nobody's ever going to be the perfection of everything. But like, what are the things that stop you from having these hard conversations?
Well, I would hope that if somebody was like, I want to stone this person, I'd be like, that's a very bad idea.
Yeah, it was an extreme example. It was very much an extreme example.
Like, I'm good. Yeah, go ahead, Elizabeth, if you want to go first, or I can go first, whatever.
I don't know about you, Ruth, but I think right now, I mean, one of the biggest ones is like the fact that we're still walking through the ordination process. I talk about this quite often with people, but like, you know, you want to do right by your church and you want everything to like look okay, simply because we're not to the point where we're ordained yet, and we're kind of, I don't know, I feel like that just makes it seem sometimes like we're being watched a little more closely to see how things are going.
It's just for people who aren't aware, what me and Elizabeth are right now is we are provisional elders in the United Methodist Church, which means that we have not been officially we've been backed by our conference, but we haven't been like backed by our conference, right? So we're not officially ordained. It's sort of like tenure for teachers. So
or residency in a medical field.
Or residency in a medical field, right? So they can
that one makes a lot more sense than tenure for me, at the very least.
That's good. That's and so basically they could still say no to us, right? So they could still say no, and then we could essentially lose our jobs.
I mean, and logically, like I think you and I both logically know, like it's probably not going to happen that they say no to us if we've gotten this far along. I think the worst that could happen is a wait, unless we really do something bad between now and November.
Like start a podcast called Church is Stupid.
Well, you started that a year ago.
You can't.
They've had plenty of time.
Wouldn't that just be the nail in the coffin, huh?
Right. Yeah. Well, and Elizabeth, I think that's a fair point. I think that stops people, this idea of being out there on their own, in essence, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you don't have the backing of a conference. You don't have the backing of an ordination to say, look, I am a trusted person. I'm an authority on what I am saying. There's a reason why I'm saying it.
Yeah, I mean, we do have the backing of the conference, and they're saying like, hey, we do believe this. It's just, you know, for me, it's more like not the trouble taking up my authority so much. It's more that like, it just feels like there's so much more pressure to do well and have your church be happy and healthy and whole all the time, or presented in that way. And having the hard conversations can really, really maybe take away from that a little bit, and rocking the boat a little bit can stir some things up in ways that sometimes you're like, is this the best thing to do?
Well, I mean, regardless if it's like your priority with like in your job, and whether you consciously think it's like the most important thing or not, like essentially you guys still almost have something to prove, or something to like show, like to get validation in almost a way, right? Is that a fair way of putting it? Like even though it might not be as intense as that sounds, like it just feels
intense.
Yeah,
I think. And I don't know if that ever really goes away even after pastors are ordained, because I mean, the nature of the Methodist Church is that you move around, you go into community to community. Sometimes you may not have the hard conversations because you simply don't have time to with your congregation. And sometimes you might not want to have the hard conversations because you don't want to leave a mess for the next person to clean up, you know? And I think this might be something that, you know, you don't want to delve too deep into. There's some sort of thing in the back of your mind that says, if we delve too deep into this could destroy the church, and we don't want to do that. At least maybe that's just how my mind works. Like sometimes I'm like, if I go too deep into this, or I have this conversation, or I push this button a little bit more, am I doing more harm than I'm doing good? and thinking of, well, what is harm in this case? Or am I just defining somebody's upset, so I've harmed them? That sort of thing.
Yeah. I can imagine that it would be difficult to gauge how far or how deep into having like some sort of difficult conversation and potentially like, bringing up hurt and like stirring a pot. Like I can only imagine how difficult it can be to try to like gauge whether or not, like the intensity of that sort of conversations or the effects of it are Christ-like or just out of like spite and are like a bad thing. Because I know a lot of people I feel, it's really easy to when they think of like, well, what would Jesus do? Well, nothing that would ever cause harm is a thing that I think a lot of people sort of think. And I think to like an extent that they're right, but I think people also can kind of tend to forget that having a hard conversation doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing harm to another person. Or to a group of people, like a congregation, right?
Yeah, and when we associate discomfort with harm, that's where the thing comes in. It's like we say Jesus wouldn't do any harm, but there's people who say, well, Jesus wouldn't make anybody uncomfortable, or Jesus wouldn't give a pat on the back, or Jesus wouldn't, convict people.
Exactly.
And that's where it's wrong, is like when you swing too much into Jesus as like this loving, peacekeeping, all is good all the time sort of person, and you forget the times where Jesus got mad, or Jesus convicted people, or Jesus called people out,
like outright. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And he never caused harm, and he always had that invitation into the beloved community open. But we don't like that. We don't like it when we're made uncomfortable. And we think that it's harming us when our sensibilities of the world are kind of being challenged and pushed back on. Particularly like with something as sensitive as talking with white people about race and racism, right? Yeah. We grow up with this idea that racism is this individual thing, and all of a sudden now our eyes are being opened up to the systemic ways and of that racism has been perpetuated in our country. And suddenly now in a conversation about race in the church, what we're fighting against or pushing on is this idea of like, well, I'm not individually racist, and so to say that I'm caught up in the systemic issue, you're making me uncomfortable, and I don't like that, and you're calling me a bad person, and that's not what Jesus would do.
Wow, yeah.
So I think the biggest thing is like having the hard conversations is one of the biggest hurdles we have to get over. Is like, we're going to have to all agree to be uncomfortable here. And have that be an okay thing to be.
Yeah, I like that. That's a really good way of putting it. I really like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. And going back, Andy, to your original question of what would make me personally, not have a conversation about a hard topic, is I'm really the wrong person to ask that question to, because I'm a challenger personality on the Enneagram. So I tend to be the person in the room who does take that on head on and want to have those conversations. I mean, I'm sure seen it on multiple occasions. And usually the thing that will keep me from having that hard conversation is if I don't know enough about the topic. If I don't know enough about the topic, then I'm much more apt to be like, I would like to talk to you about it, but I don't actually have the right information, but I will try to find it for you. So that's one way, or the other is if I have to make sure that it's done through the proper channels, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that we can talk about a little bit more on our next episode for Thursday. In the meantime, I'd like to remind you that you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, on Twitter. You can also listen to us pretty much wherever you can listen to podcasts, and also on YouTube. So, we got lots of places. We also are running our supplementary Church is Stupid, but Bible study under the name Church is Stupid, but Bible Study Edition. And that's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcast, Anchor, and more. Someone listened on an Amazon Alexa the other day. Oh, didn't even know you could do that.
Oh my goodness.
But hey, it told me. That's weird. I shouldn't know that. Anyhow, sorry for whoever that was. I'm really creepy. But I'd like to thank you again, Elizabeth, for joining us. I pointed at you like you were here, but you're not here. You're in the computer.
Well, you pointed at the computer.
It's fair. But
Get her out of there.
Get me out of here.
from all of us here at Church is Stupid,
Comma butt.
I'm Ruth.
I'm Andy.
I'm Elijah.
I'm Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, and we hope you have a great week.